Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Gizem. Nice to see you here. How are you guys? Hi. I see some familiar names. Welcome back. Let me share my screen really quickly. Yes. I'm sure you can all see my screen, right? Yes. All right. So today we will have our writing section together, task 2, and we will specifically focus on discussion essays, which is a task 2 essay type in IELTS Academic Writing. To start with the band descriptors, let me share this part. Yes. Um, so this is the public version of IELTS writing task band descriptors. You can find this online anytime you want since it's the public version. And as you can see on the screen, there are 4 criteria that they assess you on. The first one is task response, the second one is coherence and cohesion, the third one is lexical resource, which is a vocabulary, and the last one is grammatical range and accuracy. So we will go about one by one and understand what these mean. So to get a good grade in task achievement, you need to answer the question, but to do that, you need to understand the question type. As I've said, there are different types of essays, and this one today we will focus on the discussion essays. And the second thing you need to do to get a good grade in task achievement is to make your position or opinion clear if the question asks for your opinion. Thirdly, you need to use the correct essay structure, which has 4 paragraphs, introduction, body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, and a conclusion. And lastly, you need to write more than 250 words. And this is the task achievement criteria. Then we have coherence and cohesion. And to get a good grade in this one, you need to plan your essay as a whole. You need to give examples and provide evidences. And lastly, you need to be consistent. So you cannot change your mind while answering your question. You need to have a clear opinion and you need to be consistent with that opinion throughout your essay. So planning is really important for this part. Thirdly, we have lexical resources. And to get a good grade in this one, you need to use a wide range of vocabulary. And of course, you can make some rare minor mistakes, but they're all right. And you need to have a good vocabulary range and you need to use those vocabulary precisely. So you need to use them correctly. And you need to use synonyms where possible. So, for example, you shouldn't repeat the same words all over again. For example, you shouldn't say good all the time, but you should say, for example, beneficial. And some words, of course, don't have direct synonyms. And in this case, you need to try to rewrite the sentence as a whole. And you need to try to use some uncommon words related to the subject. We will talk about those while we have our example essay. Then, to get a good grade in grammatical range and accuracy, which is the last part, you need to use different sentence types. So, for example, you need to use both simple sentences and compound sentences, which like compound two ideas together with linking words such as and, for, yet, but, so, and nor. And you need to also use complex sentences, which we will talk about in a second. You need to use passive sentences, question sentences, and conditional sentences consisting of modal verbs and if. And the reason why we need to use all these different sentence types is that we need to show the examiner that we can use all of them. So our English grammar is good and we can use them correctly. That will get us like band 9 or 8 scores. So let's see the let's see the question. So our question today, as we've talked about, it's a discussion essay question type, is some people believe that professionals such as doctors and engineers should be required to work in the country where they did their training. Others believe they should be free to work in another country if they wish. And the question asks us to discuss both of these views and give our opinion. And also the question goes, give reasons for your answer and include any relevant examples from your own knowledge and experience. And as we've said, we need to write at least 250 words. So, The question in IELTS exam, by the way, will be exactly the same as this. So they will give you an information sentence like this one. They will give you the question, and they will give you these two sentences, which is like which appears in every IELTS exam, basically. So, how to write a discussion essay? First of all, as we've said, we need to write an introduction paragraph. And in this introduction paragraph, we need to paraphrase the statement, the information sentence given to us here. So basically, you don't have to add anything else to this statement. What you need to do is you need to use synonyms and different grammar structures and rewrite this sentence only. And this will be the first thing that you will write in your essay in the introduction paragraph. So, paraphrasing basically means using synonyms, different grammar structures, and changing the sentence that is already given to us. And we will basically give the same meaning using different things. Then, in the introduction paragraph, we need to state two supporting reasons. So, for example, if we're talking about professionals such as doctors and engineers being required to work in the country where they did their training, we need to find a supporting reason for that. And also, we need to find a supporting reason for this one. So, they can work in any other country if they wish to do so. And lastly, in the introduction paragraph, we need to state our opinion. And this is very important. So we need to agree or disagree with the given statement. And we need to kind of be consistent with it throughout our essay. Then we will write our main paragraph one, which should start with a topic sentence where we need to write about one side of the argument. So, for example, we can talk about the first argument in the first body paragraph. And we also need to give reasons and explanations, examples that support that idea. So they should work in the same place where they did their training. And in the second main body paragraph, we need to give again a topic sentence as the first sentence, but in this in this paragraph, we will write about the other side. So, for example, if you wrote about the first side in the first body paragraph, you need to write about the second argument in the second body paragraph. And you also need to give reasons and explanations as to when and how that second idea can be true. And lastly, in the conclusion paragraph, we need to rewrite the statement. So remember, we paraphrased the statement in the introduction. We need to do the same in the conclusion. So we need to again paraphrase the statement that is given to us. Then we will summarize the key points of our main paragraphs and we will talk about both of them. And again, lastly, we will state our opinion. So we will write our opinion. Now, do you have any questions about how the organization goes and how our essay is assessed? And if you have any questions or if you want to tell me anything at any point during the session, you can use the chat box to answer me or ask me any questions. All right, any questions regarding the organization or the band descriptors? Let me wait for a few seconds. All right, seems like there are no questions or things to say. So now let's talk about three common mistakes that people make in IELTS discussion essays. The first important thing is not stating your opinion. So basically, because these discussion essays ask for your opinion, you need to give your opinion clearly. And where do you need to give that? You need to give that in the introduction and in the conclusion. All right. The second common mistake is not giving arguments for both views. Remember, you need to support the both of the arguments in different paragraphs, and you need to give enough arguments for both of those. And lastly, some people are not developing both sides of the argument equally. As I've said, even though you agree or disagree with the statement or agree with one part of the statement, you need to discuss both of the views and you need to do that equally. So you shouldn't give more importance to the one that you're supporting, basically. And It doesn't matter actually which side of the argument you take, or even that you actually agree with it. In the IELTS exam, in IELTS writing, they don't care about your opinions. What they do care about is how you support and explain them and example them, and how you use your English, basically. As you can remember, in the band descriptors, we don't have a criteria such as opinions, right? So your opinions don't really matter. What matters is how you support those ideas and how your English is, basically. But also consistency is really important. And however, you must give equal attention to both sides, as we've said. So you shouldn't give a stronger argument for the point that you favor. If you have an unbalanced essay, you will have a lower score. And in the chat box, someone asked saying, "Can you tell a few examples of paraphrasing?" Yes, of course, and we will actually do that right now. Let's move on to the second paragraph. Sorry, second page. Let me. I'm sorry. I'm still a bit feeling like ill. I can cough sometimes. I'm sorry about that. And my voice cracks. I'm sorry about that too. Let me take a sip of my coffee. All right. We will have a paraphrasing example right now. So let's remember our question. It said some people should work in the country where they did their training, and others believe that they should be free to work in another country if they wish to do so. And we need to discuss both opinions. Now, what are the two sides of this we can write about? So we can either support the idea saying that they should work in the same place. So let's say in the same place here, in the same place. How can we support this? And we should also find arguments for another country. And there's a question on the chat box saying, can we use phrasal verbs in writing tasks? Yes, you can. Basically, I think it's best to show your level of English and vocabulary however you can. The only things that you cannot use are simple, really like daily language. So, for example, I think using
Hmm.
good wouldn't.
Body is made up
Sorry,
of different parts called organs.
sorry,
ये
I
filling the blanks ही गलत है.
someone is speaking, they unmuted themselves. If you have a question,
Body के different parts होते हैं.
sorry, you can ask it now. Elsa, was your microphone on by mistake, or do you have a question? I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry. I was speaking. Maybe that was by mistake. All right. Okay. All right. So, yeah, what was I saying? Yes, you can use phrasal verbs, but I wouldn't use phrasal verbs like too much, because what we ideally want to do is to show the examiner that we have a lot of different things, right? Okay, so sorry. Now let's talk about the two sides that we can write about and how we can support those two ideas. You can use the chat box to answer me. So, how can we argue for the idea that people should be required to work in the country where they did their training, and how can we support that they can work in another country if they wish to do so? You can use the chat box. We're basically just thinking and like finding out ideas that we can use in our exam. And this is actually a really important part of writing, which is called like outlining. We need to plan our essay, as you might remember, to get a good grade in coherence and cohesion and also task response. So really like trying to figure out what you need to write and can write before you actually start writing is really, really important in this part. So how can we support that they should be required to work in the same country? Why do you think some people believe that they should be required to work in the country where they did their training? Is the question clear to you, or are you just shy to give your opinions? All right, so Anna has an answer on the chat box saying pros for another country. People are free to choose their career opportunities. Yes, I think that's a really good point, by the way. They're free to choose, basically. Yes. And secondly, she says if a person pays his or her education by him or herself and not the government, so a person is free to choose where to work. Yes, so you're saying if they're paying, they should decide, basically. If they're paying, they should decide. All right. I think this is not so much of a second supporting idea, but I think it's more like a supporting idea for this one. So I'm not writing it as a second point. And Mariam says, working in the country where they did their training will be easy because there will be no language barriers and they know the culture of that country. So no language barriers, yes, I think that's a really good point. And they know the culture, yes, know the culture, yes. And Anna, you raised your hand. Do you want to add something or?
Yes, it just I mentioned the second point about another country just because in my country, if you are studying for free and it's government who pay your education, it's mandatory to work for the country for several years, especially if you are medicine doctor or something like this. So you are obliged to work for the country, and then after 2 or 3 years you can go whenever you want. That's why I mentioned the second point. It's like example of my country.
All right, thank you so much. By the way, it's the same in my country as well, where I live. So we can get that as a second point, but we need to make sure that we support this without using the same arguments as the first point. I didn't write it as a second point because I thought that would be a bit challenging because they're similar but not so much. But you explained it to me in a really good English, and I think you can support it as a second point too. So that's why I changed it to second point. And someone also said working in the same place is really crucial to develop their own country. Yes, to develop their country. I'm going to add their country. I think these are all really good points. But what we need to also do is to think about how we can give examples and how we can explain these opinions. So basically, as they don't grade us on our opinions, we need to explain them. We need to be explained them. And while you're outlining your essay like this one, like really short sentences or words that will remind you of your points, I think it would be best if you also thought about the examples. For example, to support the idea that there is no language barriers, how can we give an example? So, for example, we can say, since if they move to another country, let's say Brazil, they need to know Brazilian to work with the patients. So the doctors need to know what the patients are saying. So they need to know Brazilian. And if they work in their same place, in the same place where they did their training, they will obviously know the language, so they don't have to have that like miscommunication between the doctors and the patients, because being a doctor is basically uh, first and foremost listening to what the patient has, right? So as you can see, we could support and give an example to this idea. and what you need to do, I think, would be to think about the examples and explanations while also thinking about the opinions. I'm not going to write it down. I just wanted to show you how a good outline works. Because if we think about these before we actually start writing things, then we won't have to think about what to write while we're actually writing the essay. All right. Do you have any questions about the outlining part or how you can find ideas or examples or explanations? If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can use the chat box. Let me wait for a few seconds. How can we find ideas? I think it's a really good question because, of course, some people might not be able to find ideas really quickly. What I find really helpful is to ask how and why these things happen and when these things happen. How and why usually works best, but when also works sometimes. So, for example, the question said some people believe that professionals such as doctors should be required to work in the country where they did their training. And I'm asking myself, why is this the case? So, why should professionals should be required to work in the same country where they did their training? And the answer that I find to that why question is actually one of the arguments, right? So, why should they be required to work where they did their training? Because there will be no language barriers. As you can see, when you ask why, you will come up with an idea, like some sort of an answer, and you can use that in your essay. And asking how is again really helpful because we can say, for example, how there will be no language barriers. And the answer is they already know the language, right? And this will be our example. I think these work really well. And we can also ask when, saying, let's say, this question, when they should be free to work in another country, they should be able to work in free to work in another country when they're free, if they're free, right? And this will be again our point, one of our points. Asking these questions, these three questions, especially how and why, I think are really helpful when finding ideas. Any other questions? All right, if there are no questions, let's talk about paraphrasing. I think this is sometimes challenging. This might be challenging for some people. What you need to do is to paraphrase a statement, you need to understand the statement first and think about how differently you could have said the same thing. So, for example, instead of saying, in the question, some people believe, we can say some people argue. So we can use the synonyms of the words that we're given. Or, for example, instead of saying some people, we could also say some. Instead of some people, we could only use some argue, which would be the same thing, basically. And the question also said professionals such as these people should be required to work in the country where they did their training. And we said the graduated students, the professionals, right? A synonym for that. In medicine and engineering, a synonym of doctors and engineers should be applied to professions in the country where they studied. So, where they did their training, where they studied, right? So, we can use the synonyms and different ways of saying the same thing. So, instead of saying the profession, like doctors and engineers, we can say medicine and engineering, and they studied in these areas and fields. Paraphrasing is really works best if you think about how else you could have said the same thing. So if we thought about like a synonym of doctor, we wouldn't be able to find anything because a doctor is a doctor, right? But if we think like doctors are people who study in medicine, there is your paraphrased version. So you can think about how else you could have said the same thing. You could have referred to the same people or ideas, basically. And Elsa asks on the question box, chat box saying, how many synonyms of one word we have to remember? So there's basically no limit to it. But what I would do is I would choose a few, like maybe three synonyms for each word that I use frequently. So, for example, instead of saying important all the time, I would try to remember significant, crucial, and vital, maybe. And these are just words that come to my mind. And I would have four words mean more or less the same thing. So I would say maybe through two or three um, synonyms of a word would work for you because you will only have to write 250 words. So I doubt that you will use the same word more than three times. I think 3 is a good number here. But also, as I've said, you shouldn't always think about like direct synonyms. You should also think about how else you could have said the same thing. So, for example, instead of saying doctors, people who study in medicine, I think, is a really good synonym. It's a paraphrasing, not synonym, but a paraphrasing. I think that would work best for you because if you only write the direct synonym, you won't be changing the grammatical structure. So instead of saying believe, we said argue. Where is it? Argue. Yeah, here. And we didn't actually change anything in terms of grammar. But when we write graduated student in medicine, we also changed the grammatical structure, right? We didn't just say doctor, we also used like a passive voice here. I think that works best. Now, let's talk about the second idea. Others believe they should be free to work in another country. And we also said, while others believe, but we put a while here and connected the two sentences. Why? Because as if you remember, we need to also use compound sentences and complex sentences. And complex sentences are basically sentences that you uh, put together using different linking words. And while is a really good, I think, linking word because it talks about two contrasting ideas and it connects two sentences together. So we have overall a really long and complex sentence when we use while. And we said while others believe that job requirements, instead of saying they should be free to work in another country, we said job requirements not be limited in the trained country. So they should be free. They can be free, right? Remember, sorry, did you realize that we didn't change they should be free? As you can see, we don't have to change everything. We only need to change things that we can paraphrase and use synonyms for. So basically, if you cannot find anything to say, instead of saying they should be free, you can write they should be free. It's all right. And then we said, in my opinion, all people have the freedom to select their lives and workplace. As if you remember, we need to give our opinion in the last sentence of the introduction paragraph, and this is exactly what we did, saying, in my opinion, all people have the freedom to select their lives and workplace, so we're agreeing with the second opinion, right? And now there are a few questions on the chat box, and keep them coming while I'm answering the others if you have any questions on introduction and paraphrasing. So Anna asks, I don't know how to incorporate two supporting ideas in the introduction. With which phrase is it better to start? That's a hard question actually because it changes from the essay type to another essay type. For example, in discussion essays, since we usually have two different ideas, we can use contrasting linking words. Can you give me examples of contrasting linking words, all of you? Contrasting linking words. So when we need to contrast two different arguments, what can we say? Yes, we can use while, we can use whereas, however, yes, nevertheless, nonetheless. I wouldn't use yet. Yet is also a contrast. Yet is also used to contrast something, but I think the others are better than yet, so I wouldn't use yet. I think basically others are more academic than yet, so I would use that one. We can say on the other side, although, yes, you're coming up with great linking words here. So basically, when you need to contrast two ideas, you can use any of these linking words. But for example, if you're talking about two ideas that more or less say the same thing, you can use when, while, or those linking words that do not have a contrast meaning, basically. So you can also use relative clauses. For example, if you want to give an adjective to a word, so basically your question has too many answers. What I would do is I would choose a few linking words from all different meanings. So, for example, I would choose uh, a few words that have a contrastive meaning in them. I would choose some that have the same meaning. I would choose some that give like an example, and I would like try to use whichever is best in that specific context and sentence. So basically, that changes. I know this is like a really general response, but basically, your question does not have like one simple answer. Ansa, I'm sorry. Anna or Ansa, I don't know which one you asked. All right, Anna. But I think in the any one of these would be really good for contrasting ideas, for discussion essays. And someone says, in my opinion, at least 5 years should spend in the same country where they studied. So you're stating your opinion as an example. I think that's a really good answer. But you should pay attention to how you form your sentence. So basically, your sentence lacks the SVO rule. So subject, verb, object agreement. You need to have a correct subject, a verb, and an object. So basically, you can say they should spend at least 5 years in the same country where they studied. So your sentence is grammatically a bit off due to subject object use. Uh, what you can do is you can try to write your sentences while also paying attention to subject, verb, and object. So basically, which person or who does the job, basically. And if you follow this structure, I think you will have no problem with this sentence structure. Uh, cool Deep, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. This one for you. And Mariam says, articles used more frequently if you write them more than one time. Is it okay? Let me try to understand your question. Articles used more frequently if you write them more than one more time. More than one time. Mariam, I'm sorry, but I couldn't understand your question. Can you paraphrase your question in different using different sentences or words maybe, because I couldn't understand? Or if you want, you can raise your no, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask me that question verbally. Both are fine. Mariam, are you there? Mariam. You can use the chat box or unmute yourself. Both are fine, but I couldn't understand your question. I'm sorry. So while you're doing that, let me move on to another question. So, is it better to use structures like why, how, when, and so on? So, basically, as I said, we're trying to use a lot of different things. So, we need to use simple, complex, compound sentences, modal verbs, passive sentences. So, basically, anything you use, anything different you use, is better than the ones that you have already used. So, basically, writing whereas all over again, even though it's a really good academic linking word, wouldn't give you any points. What you need to do is try to use different linking words, different ways of connecting two sentences. So I cannot say like using why, how, when is better than whereas, nevertheless, nonetheless, because they are all important equally, and you need to try to use at least once of each of them. So at least one of each of them, basically. So maybe put a relative clause here and a noun clause there, and use a gerund where you can. So basically, I think one is not better than the other in any case, because if they're academic, they're good, and you need to use kind of one of each of them, if that makes sense. All right, any other questions about the introduction paragraph, or how to outline, or how to paraphrase? Let me wait for a few seconds. All right, seems like there are no questions. Now let's talk about, sorry, Mariam has a question. We use and the, are, a more than one time. Is it okay to use them 2 or 3 times or when we need because we cannot paraphrase them? Oh, of course. Yeah. Of course, you can use the, a, or an uh, as much as you want because they're necessary to use in any sentence, basically. So, for example, uh, where is that? We didn't use any the. Yes, we used it here. So, because it's necessary to use the here, we cannot say, oh, I've used the here once, so I shouldn't use it here again. It's it doesn't work like that. So the, a, and n are necessary to use when we write a word, basically, when we write a noun. So it doesn't matter how many times you use them, as long as they're correct, basically. So, and since there are no paraphrased versions of the, a, or n, or maybe more than, you can use them anytime you want and however much you want. I hope that makes sense, and I hope I understood your question correctly. Divya asks, ma'am, I feel believe and argue are two different words. Then how did we use argue as a synonym? That's a perfect question. I was waiting for that, actually. So basically, believe means like believe and argue, yes, do not exactly mean the same thing, right? So they're not like direct synonyms. But remember that we said we don't have to use direct synonyms as long as they more or less mean the same thing. So basically, believing believing in something, and arguing for something, even though they're not the same thing, like exactly the same thing, they more or less give the same idea. So we can use them synonymously in this case. But also you could say like claim or assert or say even that more or less again mean the same thing. Or instead of believe, you can say are of the opinion that. So they think like that. They are also synonyms. Basically, it doesn't matter that there are no direct synonyms as long as you give more or less the same idea using different things, basically. Hope that answers your question. And if at any point I'm not answering your question or you're not satisfied with my answer, any of you, you can add to your question and say more, ask more. I will explain it to you however much I need to. Prashamsha asks if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It is compulsory to state two supporting ideas in introduction. Yes, definitely. Because since this is the discussion essay and there are two different sides, and you need to discuss both of these views, you need to absolutely talk about both of the ideas in the introduction. Absolutely. If you don't do it, that will actually result in a lower score. Any other questions? This is going really well. I'm so glad that you're participating and asking questions, by the way. Any other questions? All right. Let's move on to main paragraph 1 then. As we have talked about, we need to support one of the arguments, one side of the argument in the main paragraph 1, and the other side of the argument in the main paragraph 2. And while doing that, we need to first and foremost give a topic sentence introducing the one side that we will talk about in that specific paragraph. So in the first sentence, we said, on the one hand, so on the one side, it is true that graduated people should continue in a country that supports them in the educational system. So, what do we understand when we read this first sentence? We understand as the examiner that you're going to talk about the first side of the argument, saying that they should be required to work where they did their training, because it says people should continue in a country that supports them in the educational system. And I want you to pay attention that we also paraphrased the same statement here too, saying that they, graduated people instead of graduated students, should continue in a country, so they should work in the country that supports them in the educational system, so where they did their training, right? So we paraphrased the same thing again. And even though these three sentences do not give the exact same meaning, they give the same idea. So while paraphrasing, we don't have to give the exact same meaning, we will give the exact same idea, which are two different things. The exact same meaning uh, means that we need to give the same meaning, uh, like without any missing points. But giving the same idea only means that you need to more or less uh, show that you're saying more or less that sentence, if that makes sense. So paraphrasing doesn't mean writing the exact same thing. It means that you need to kind of refer to that idea, if that makes sense, hopefully. And we supported this idea saying for these people, so for people who will work in their same place where they did their training, the government spent a lot of budget by paying investments to universities and student loans. For example, we need to have an example. The government have supported laboratory facility and well-educated tutors for universities, as well as accommodation and decent food for students. It is time for educated people who use all of the equipment and facilities to contribute to the country and use the knowledge for the development of the country. Therefore, if they don't stay in the country, it's a waste of resources for the government. And as you can see, what we did after giving the example is to explain how this example is relevant to that idea, saying it's time for them to pay back, basically, while also giving enough details. Giving enough details while supporting your idea is really, really important because, as I've said, they don't grade your ideas or opinions, they grade how you explain those ideas and opinions. So the way you need to explain your ideas is detailed. You need to give enough details. And in this one, for example, we said decent food, even though we don't need to. We said decent food. Why? Because it gives a detail. It makes the argument more convincing. And while we're writing an essay, we need to actually convince the examiner that these points, all of these points and explanation and examples are relevant because they're convincing. And while doing that, as you can see, we've used a lot of different vocabulary, synonyms, and paraphrases where possible, saying educated people instead of graduated people, or students or professionals. We said educated people. Or we said, where is that? Well educated tutors, or where is that? There was something else that we used for this. Uh, they, for example, even if a simple pronoun like they is really important because we're not repeating the same thing. Also, we've used correct linking words saying, for example, while giving an example, and therefore while explaining something. And these are all really important. And we've also used relative clauses, for example, people who use, or we've also used as well as to show that we also know that one. And we've used if to show that we know that one too. So basically, we tried to show the examiner that we know a lot of different grammar structures and vocabularies, academic vocabulary, while we're also explaining our opinion and idea. Do you have any questions in main paragraph one and how to write it and what not to do? So, what not to do is basically you should give enough details, so you shouldn't not give enough details. And you shouldn't repeat the same things all over again. You shouldn't just give a point and leave it without explaining it. You need to explain everything. And you shouldn't use the same structures all the time. You need to have different grammar structures that will help the examiner understand that you know all these different things. Any other questions? All right, if there are no questions, let's talk about the second main body paragraph. We will do the same thing for the other side of the argument. So, saying, on the other hand, as you can see, the first paragraph and the second body paragraph connect with each other really well too. So saying on the other hand means that we will talk about the other side of the argument. Re has a question. Let me answer that, and then I will start the second body paragraph. In main paragraph, do we need to use only one example, or we can use more than that? Of course, you can use more than that, but I wouldn't write or recommend writing more than two examples. I think a maximum of two examples is best, and if you can write, I think one example would also be enough, because it doesn't matter how many examples you give as long as you give at least one. And what is more important than the number of examples is how you explain them and how you connect your example with your overall idea, your overall statement. So basically, I think you should give one or a maximum of two examples, and you should focus on how you connect those examples to the main idea, how you explain those examples. I think that will make you achieve a higher score. And there's another question saying, how can we use apostrophe like we write in? Yes, so this one you're asking, I think. Actually, I think that's a really good question, by the way. In an academic writing, you should not write something like this. So you shouldn't shorten don't. Instead, you should write do not, because writing them as separately as do not is the academic version, actually. But if you have such a good English that, uh, like, you can use different grammar structures, vocabulary, and paraphrasing, synonyms, whatever, if you have a really, really good English, then writing don't instead of do not will not affect your score that much. So it will not reduce your score that much. But even though it doesn't affect our score that much if we have a really good English, I wouldn't still risk it. So if I was taking the exam right now, I wouldn't write don't, even though I have a like really good English. I wouldn't write don't. I would write do not. If you're asking this one, your answer is this. If you're asking this one here, we use that one without another like another uh, thing after it, is because this is plural. When we're using students loans, because this is plural and it ends with an s, we don't have to add another s here. So normally we would say, my name is Gizem, as I've said. We would say Gizem's cat, right? But when we're saying students cat, we should do it like this, because this is plural and ends with an S. Hope that answers your questions. All right, now let's move on to main paragraph 2. We said, on the other hand, because we will talk about the second side of the argument, saying, in the modern era, people have the freedom to select to work anywhere they want. Firstly, highly educated individuals select overseas, because of better job opportunities and high salaries, so they can improve their standards of living. So we have given one argument to support the idea that they are free to select where they work because they have better job opportunities in the other place. Secondly, the origin country may not have, that's a mistake by us, may not have adequate facilities and equipped laboratories for high degree work, such as nuclear medicine that needs a new tech MRI scanner device. Finally, for some university majors, there are only theoretical courses and there's no job for these kinds of degrees. For instance, a sailor is a subject in a country without any surroundings by the sea. So they will have to move somewhere else, right? Now, let's talk about the main paragraph too. As Kuldeep says on the chat box, the second point is not really clear, right? So this one, the origin country may not have enough facilities and equipped laboratories for high degree work, such as nuclear medicine that needs a new tech or scanner device. And I agree to some extent. It needs, I think, one more sentence to explain what this idea means. But then again, I think it's enough by itself because it has like an example in itself saying nuclear medicine needs a new tech. So it actually provides maybe enough detail to explain the second argument, but I agree that it could work better if it had another sentence, like explaining sentence. And Anna says, is an example about a sailor relevant if we are asked about doctors? I think that's a really good question, Anna, by the way. Let's read our question once more. It says, professionals such as doctors and engineers. And such as means that we're giving an example. So it doesn't specifically say doctors and engineers. It says such as doctors and engineers. So we can add teachers, sailors, whatever we want. Basically, it says professionals, not only doctors and engineers, professionals in general. So, of course, a sailor is relevant because it gives doctors and engineers as example, not as the only points that you can talk about. Hope that's clear. Mariam says origin country mean their home country. Yes, origin country means home country. So that where they originate from, if that makes sense. All right. Um, So, what I would do, by the way, in the second paragraph, I think that is the issue with this paragraph, is that it has three different supporting ideas. Whereas for this one, we didn't have three, right? And that actually is not ideal while writing an essay. What we need to do is, I think, to give maybe one or two supporting ideas for each paragraph and explain them rather than writing a third opinion or supporting idea. I think that is the issue with this paragraph. But even though it has more supporting ideas than the first one, again, because this has a really good English and it is still consistent and it still explains the same thing while giving examples, it wouldn't reduce the score of this person that much. Still, to not risk it, I wouldn't choose to write more than one or two ideas for each paragraph. I wouldn't write three if I'm not writing three for each one. So basically, the number of the supporting arguments that you have should be more or less the same in the two body paragraphs. Any other questions regarding this one? And while you're asking your questions, I will explain why this is a good paragraph. This is a good paragraph because it has examples for each idea that it has, saying sailors, nuclear medicine, and high salaries, better job opportunities, blah, blah, blah. And it also gives relevant and consistent linking words, saying firstly, to introduce the first argument, secondly, to introduce the second argument, and finally, to introduce the last argument. And it doesn't always give the same grammar structures. Again, it says for instance instead of for example, because he or she used that one in the first paragraph. It doesn't say for example, for instance, or for example over and over again. It says such as here. It says so instead of therefore. I think you could use thus, hence, therefore, because I think they're more academic than so, but still, we need to use both simple and complex structures, so is fine too. It says because of instead of saying because, and because of are used differently, and the test taker shows that he or she can use because of too. Again, so overall, it uses a lot of different grammatical structures and synonyms. Any questions? All right, now let's move on to the conclusion paragraph. And this is the last paragraph that we will write. In this part, we need to rewrite the statement. Again, as we have said, we need to paraphrase the statement in the introduction and question, saying in conclusion to explain the examiner that we're in the conclusion paragraph now, which is again really important. I accept that graduated people should continue to work in a country where they trained for years. But in my opinion, everyone has their own choice to opt where to work, and it is an essential human right. So, even though this person accepts, which doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as supporting it, this person accepts that they can work where they want to, sorry, where they were trained. In his opinion, in her opinion, they have their right to choose. So it doesn't change the opinion that this person stated in the first place. So it accepts the other opinion, but this person still argues for choosing for themselves. Let me show the overall essay here. So we predict this essay will get like a band 8 or 9 from the exam. The reason why it can get a 9 is because it has a lot of different uses of grammar and vocabulary, and it is consistent, and it has correct like outlining, paragraphing, and all that. But it could also get an 8 or 8.5, I think. I think this would get at least an 8.5 because the second paragraph has more supporting ideas, and there are a few mistakes that this person makes, such as saying may don't, which is wrong, and saying don't, and yeah, not giving enough explanations for this one, and instead having more opinions than this one. But other than that, I think this is a really, really good example of an essay and how to write an essay and how to paraphrase and use synonyms. If you want, you can take the screenshot of this page and try to incorporate any of the words or grammar structures that you don't know in your essay. I think that will help you a lot. And what I would do is I would time myself and write essays, like practice writing essays using the structures that we have learned today. Any questions on any parts of this class? Any questions? All right, let me wait for a few seconds. And while doing that, while waiting, I will share a survey form with you on the chat box. Let me do that. My computer first, yes, all right. Those of you who have not already filled this survey form, so for people who did not filled this survey form before, I would really appreciate it if you filled the survey form up and give any suggestions, questions, anything you want to say to us in that survey form. That would be great because we take them really seriously and we always try to hear you and better ourselves. I would really be helpful. Sorry, it would really be helpful if you filled the survey form up, basically. And those of you who already filled the survey form before this class, you don't have to do it again. All right. Elsa says, because most of the time universities ask for 7 or 7.5 in writing, can you teach us to write a band 7 essay? I will take note of that, and you can also write that in the survey form to remind us again, and we will of course try to do that in a few sessions that we have. All right. By the way, writing a 7 or 7.5 essay is actually not that different from a band 8 or 9 essay in terms of their use of grammar and vocabulary. So to get a band 7 or 7.5, you need to still have a variety of synonyms and paraphrasing and grammatical structures in your essay. What is different in 7.5 is that you can make more mistakes, basically. But overall, you need to have 4 paragraphs, have a variety of grammar and vocabulary knowledge, and you need to use them more or less correctly. But of course, you can make more mistakes than you could have made in Band 8 or 9 essays. But of course, I will take that to other teachers and we will do that. Any other questions? Don't forget to fill out the survey form and give us any advices, suggestions, questions, whatever you want to do or say. You can fill the survey form. Hope everyone did that. And thank you for participating. Hope to see you in our other classes, next classes. Thank you so much for coming. I'm waiting for you guys to get the survey link and ask me any questions if you have. Other than that, bye. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, I'm ending the meeting. Hope to see you back in our other classes.